Previously on Golden Tales Radio. A busy obstetrics clinic. A waiting room full of pregnant women and their partners. All growing more frustrated by the minute. Appointments were running late, and nobody could get a straight answer. From the front desk, Sarah and her husband Tom had been sitting there since 9:40 in the morning. Tom had a major work presentation to get to. The tension in the room was building. And then a sound came from behind. A closed exam room door that stopped everyone cold. A sound that no one in that room was prepared to hear. This is what happened next. Just be quiet. Those 3 words had stayed with Sarah long after the morning was over. They weren't angry or sharp. They were just the only words that made sense in that moment. All the frustration that had filled that waiting room, all the complaints about appointment times, and long waits and uncomfortable chairs, had been swallowed whole by a single sound. A sound that came from behind a closed door, and said everything without saying a word. Sarah had been sitting in that waiting room when it happened, and what she witnessed that morning would stay with her for the rest of her life. To understand what happened, we need to go back a little. While the waiting room outside was filling with tension, something else entirely was unfolding behind that closed door. Ellen had come to the clinic alone that morning. She was 38 years old, and this was her second pregnancy. Her first had been difficult in all the usual ways. The nausea, the exhaustion, the endless worry. But this time had been different. Easier. Each checkup had come back clean. No concerns, no complications. People told her that second pregnancies were like that. Smoother. Ellen had believed them. She had wanted to believe them. Her husband was away on a business trip, due back in 2 days. Today's appointment was routine, they had agreed. No reason to rearrange his schedule. Ellen had driven herself to the clinic and taken a seat, like she had done a dozen times before. When the nurse called her name, she walked into the exam room calmly. She climbed onto the table, lay back, and pulled up her shirt. The cool gel against her belly. The familiar hum of the ultrasound machine, all of it so ordinary. She stared at the ceiling and thought about what she might make for dinner. Dr. Bennett moved the probe slowly across her abdomen. His expression was the same as always. Focused, neutral, professional. Ellen wasn't watching him closely. There was no reason to. Then his hand stopped. Ellen didn't notice at first. He adjusted the angle of the probe and looked again. He moved it slightly and stopped again. Ellen turned her head toward the screen. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. But something in the quality of the silence had changed. The machine was still running. But a particular sound was missing. The rhythmic, steady sound she had heard at every single appointment before this one. The sound that meant everything was as it should be. Dr. Bennett set the probe down. He looked at Ellen, and in the careful, measured way of someone who has had to deliver impossible news before, and never gets used to it, he spoke.
"There's no heartbeat. I'm so sorry."
Ellen heard the words. But for a moment they didn't reach her. They landed somewhere just outside her understanding. Like a sentence spoken in a language she almost knew. She lay there looking at the ceiling. The room was very quiet. She thought about her husband, about how far away he was. She thought about the name they had chosen. She thought about the small room at home they had just started to set up. Dr. Bennett placed his hand gently beside hers on the table. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that would help. He simply stayed. And then something broke open inside Ellen that could not be held back. She had tried to stay still, pressing her lips together and breathing slowly. The way people do when they are trying to keep the walls from coming down. But there are things that cannot be contained. The grief moved through her entire body. And the sound that came out was not something she chose. It was something that happened to her. That sound moved through the walls of the exam room. It traveled down the hallway. And it poured into the waiting room. where Sarah and Tom and all the others were sitting. The moment that sound reached her, something shifted in Sarah's chest. She didn't know what had happened. Not yet. But she understood the sound. There are things in this world that don't require explanation. That cry was one of them. It carried its meaning directly, without translation, to every person who heard it. Sarah pressed both hands flat against her belly. Her fingers were trembling slightly. The baby moved inside her, a small slow push from somewhere deep. In that moment, that tiny movement felt like the most important thing in the world. Everything she had taken for granted over the past 38 weeks rushed at her all at once. The ordinary miracle of it. The fragility of it. Tom felt her hands shaking. Without a word, he covered them with his own. He didn't say anything about the presentation. He didn't look at his phone. He just sat beside her and held her hands, and understood. Without being told that this was the only thing that mattered right now. The waiting room had transformed. The man who had gone to the front desk to complain had returned to his seat. He was holding his wife's hand with both of his, leaning slightly toward her, saying nothing. The woman who had spoken so sharply about appointments sat with her head bowed and her hand pressed against her eyes. She wasn't embarrassed. She just couldn't stop it. People who had been quietly angry 10 minutes ago were now quietly something else. Not guilty exactly, just suddenly aware of how small their discomfort had been. Behind that door, someone was living through the worst day of her life. And none of them had known. How could they have known? But knowing that didn't make the weight any lighter. The air in the room was completely different now. That tight, bristling frustration had dissolved into something heavier and softer. When grief fills a space, it changes the quality of the air. Everyone in that waiting room felt it. Nobody spoke. Sarah stayed still for a long time. She kept her hands on her belly and focused on the baby's movements. Small and slow, the way they always were in the late morning. She had spent so much of this pregnancy worrying. About the labor, about the delivery, about whether she was eating the right things. And sleeping enough and preparing herself properly for what was coming. She had lain awake at night running through all the ways things could go wrong. But she had never truly imagined this. The kind of loss that happens before a beginning. An ending before a first breath. She couldn't fully picture it, and she didn't try. She just sat with the weight of knowing it was possible. That it happened. That it was happening, right now, 30 feet away. 38 weeks. 2 more to go, maybe less. She thought about the room they had painted last month. The small white dresser they had assembled on a Sunday afternoon. Tom cursing quietly at the instructions while she laughed from the doorway. The tiny folded clothes in the drawer. All of it waiting. Tom said nothing. He kept her hands wrapped in his and stared at a point. Somewhere on the far wall. She could feel him thinking, working through something the same way she was. When people are confronted with someone else's loss, they reach instinctively for their own most precious things. Tom was doing that now. She could feel it in the way he held on. A nurse appeared in the doorway and called Sarah's name. She stood slowly. Tom helped her up, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. The way he always did now, without thinking. They walked down the hallway together. As they passed that closed door, Sarah slowed for just a moment. She didn't stop, but she looked at it. Whatever was still happening inside that room. She carried some small piece of it with her as she walked on. The appointment went well. The baby was healthy. Position was good, heartbeat strong and steady. The doctor smiled and said they would be meeting their little one very soon. Sarah smiled back. She was genuinely relieved and genuinely happy. But underneath that happiness was something she couldn't quite name. A kind of tenderness toward her own good fortune that she hadn't felt before. On the way out, she passed the closed door one more time. Still shut. Still quiet. Somewhere inside, a woman she would never meet was sitting with a loss that would take a very long time to carry. Sarah didn't know her name. She had never seen her face. But that sound had crossed the distance between them and landed somewhere deep. And it didn't leave. They walked out to the parking lot without speaking. Got in the car. Sat for a moment in the quiet. Then Tom spoke. Not about the presentation. Not about being late. He said their baby was going to be okay. Sarah nodded and looked out the window. Waiting can be inconvenient. It can feel like wasted time. But some waits are not about time at all. Some of them are about hope. About the last moments before something irreversible. The minutes we spend sighing and checking our phones might be, for someone nearby, the last minutes of a world they knew. Sarah never forgot what she heard that day. She never learned Ellen's name, never saw her face. But that sound stayed with her. Quiet and permanent and real. There are sounds in this world that say more than any words. That waiting room taught her that. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it resonated with you, I would be grateful if you would subscribe. And share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time.